Diner owner told truckers, "This is my last day." What they organized overnight left her speechless. The coffee pot shattered against the tile floor at 5:47 a.m., and Millie Henderson didn't even flinch. She just stared at the spreading brown pool like it was her life draining away. 43 years of pre-dawn brewing and bacon grease, and keeping promises to strangers who became family. Outside, the first 18-wheeler of the morning pulled into the gravel lot, its air brakes hissing like a sigh, and Millie felt her chest tighten because she knew she had to tell them. Today was the day she'd been dreading for 6 months, the day the bank's patience ran out, the day Millie's diner on Route 40 served its last plate of eggs and toast and hope. The trucker who walked through that door was Marcus Ironhorse Sullivan, a man who'd been stopping at Millie's every Tuesday and Friday. For 17 years, ever since his wife died and Millie had stayed open 2 extra hours just so he'd have somewhere warm to sit with his grief. He took one look at Millie's face, at the coffee spreading across the floor, at the way her hands were shaking, and he knew something was catastrophically wrong. Millie tried to smile, that same smile she'd given 10,000 truckers over 4 decades, but it cracked like old paint, and the words came out in a whisper that barely made it across the counter. "This is my last day, Marcus. Bank's taking the building at noon." The silence that followed was heavier than any load Marcus had ever hauled. Millie's diner wasn't just a truck stop. It was a landmark, a lighthouse on the lonely stretch of Route 40 between Kansas City and Denver, the place where drivers knew they could get a hot meal at 3 a.m., where Millie knew your name and your kids' names, and whether you took your coffee black or with 2 sugars and a prayer. She'd fed 3 generations of truckers, had kept a wall of photos showing babies born, weddings celebrated, and too many memorial cards for drivers who never made it home. The diner was a church of chrome and formica, and Millie was its patron saint. Marcus set his thermos down slowly, his weathered hands steady despite the storm building in his chest. He'd driven 2.3 million miles in his 30-year career, had seen truck stops come and go, had watched the highway swallow up the small places that made the road feel less like exile and more like home. But Millie's was different. Millie's was sacred. He pulled out his phone, his thick fingers surprisingly nimble on the screen, and opened the CB radio app that connected him to every trucker within 200 miles. What he was about to do would either be the most beautiful thing he'd ever organized, or the fastest way to prove that the Brotherhood of the Road was more than just talk on Channel 19. "Breaker, breaker, this is Ironhorse with a 1033, and I need every driver who's ever eaten at Millie's on Route 40 to listen up because we got ourselves a situation that requires immediate action." The story of Millie Henderson was the story of American grit wrapped in a flour-dusted apron. She'd bought the diner in 1982 with money saved from 2 decades of waitressing, had raised 3 kids in the apartment above the kitchen, had buried a husband who died fixing the roof during a thunderstorm because they couldn't afford a contractor. She'd survived the recession of 2008 by extending credit to truckers who were broke, keeping a ledger of IOUs that she never really expected to collect because she understood that sometimes dignity was worth more than dollars. She'd been robbed twice, had her windows shot out once by kids with nothing better to do, and had rebuilt every time because the diner was more than a business. It was her promise to the road that there would always be light and warmth and someone who gave a damn. But the pandemic had been different. The shutdown had lasted 3 months, and even after reopening, the traffic had been thin, the margins razor-sharp. Millie had taken out a loan to keep the lights on, to keep her 2 employees paid, to keep the coffee brewing for the handful of essential drivers still running the highways. She'd thought she could recover, had believed that loyalty and hard work would be enough. But the bank didn't care about loyalty, and the corporate truck stop chain that wanted her location didn't care about the photos on the wall or the community she'd built. They cared about profit margins and franchise opportunities, and turning Millie's into another identical, soulless pit stop where nobody knew your name. "And here's where I need you to do something for me, because What happened next is the kind of story that reminds us why community matters, why the people we meet on life's highway become the family we choose. Hit that subscribe button right now, because you're about to witness something that'll restore your faith in humanity. And these stories of real heroes standing up for each other need to be heard. The truckers who answered Marcus's call that morning didn't just save a diner. They saved the idea that we don't have to let corporations and banks erase the places that make us human. Within 15 minutes of Marcus's transmission, his phone was exploding with responses. Iron Horse this. Is Mama Bear, I'm 40 miles out with a load of produce, what do you need? This is Nighthawk, Millie fed me for free when I was broke in 9, I'm turning around. Diesel Duke here. I got contacts with every driver from here to Albuquerque, spreading the word now. The CB channels lit up like Christmas, the digital network of truckers sharing information faster than any social media algorithm, because this was the real social network, the one built on diesel fumes and shared coffee, and the understanding that when one of your own was in trouble, you dropped everything and you moved. Marcus walked back to his Peterbilt 389, a midnight blue beast with 847,000 miles on the odometer, and a CB radio that had been his companion through divorce, bankruptcy, his daughter's wedding, and every lonely night when the road felt too long and the destination too far. He climbed into the cab and switched to Channel 19, the trucker's channel, the frequency where the real America talked to itself in 10 codes and road poetry. This is Iron Horse with a message for every driver who remembers what Millie's Diner means. We got 12 hours to save it, and I'm calling in every favor, every connection, every dollar we can scrape together. Millie kept us fed when we were hungry, kept us warm when we were cold, kept us human when the road tried to turn us into machines. Now it's our turn. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Drivers started rerouting mid-haul, calling dispatchers to explain they had an emergency stop to make. Retired truckers who hadn't been on the road in years started making phone calls, pulling out old contact lists, reaching out to the extended family of the highway. A trucker named Sarah Wildflower Chin, who'd gone to law school after leaving the road and now practiced in Denver, sent a message saying she was reviewing Colorado property law to see if there were any legal angles. Another driver, Tommy Wrench Martinez, who'd become a mechanic and small business owner, started calculating what it would take to buy out Millie's debt. But Marcus knew that legal maneuvers and calculations would take time they didn't have. The bank was foreclosing at noon, and the corporate chain had already sent representatives to take possession. What they needed was something bigger, something that would force everyone to pay attention, something that would show the world that Millie's Diner was worth fighting for. He made a decision that would either be brilliant or insane, possibly both, and he picked up his phone to make the first of many calls that would change everything. By 8 a.m., the parking lot of Millie's Diner was starting to fill with trucks, not just a few, but dozens, their chrome grills catching the morning sun like shields in a medieval army. Drivers were arriving from Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, even as far as Oklahoma and Wyoming, abandoning their routes and their schedules because the call had gone out and the Brotherhood had answered. Millie stood at the window, watching the trucks arrive, tears streaming down her face because she'd spent 43 years taking care of these people, and now they were here to take care of her, and the beauty of it was almost too much to bear. Marcus had organized something that hadn't been seen on American highways in decades. A trucker convoy, but not the angry political kind that made the news. This was something purer, a gathering of people who understood that community was built one cup of coffee at a time, one kind word at a time, one promise kept at a time. He'd called the local news stations, had reached out to social media influencers who covered trucker culture, had even contacted a documentary filmmaker who'd been following long-haul drivers for a project. If Millie's was going down, it was going to go down with the whole world watching. Drop a comment and tell us what you would do in this situation. Because what Marcus organized next was something that required not just courage but creativity, the kind of thinking that comes from years of solving problems on the road where there's no manual and no backup plan, just you and your wits, and the hope that doing the right thing will somehow be enough. The bank representatives arrived at 9:30 a.m. Two men in suits driving a BMW that looked absurdly out of place among the 18-wheelers. They stepped out of their car and froze, staring at the scene before them like they'd stumbled into another dimension. The parking lot was packed with trucks, at least 60 of them now, their engines idling in a low rumble that sounded like distant thunder. Drivers stood in groups, drinking coffee from thermoses, talking quietly, their presence a silent statement that this foreclosure wasn't going to be easy or quiet or invisible. Marcus met the bank representatives at the door, his 6'3" frame blocking their entrance like a human wall. "Gentlemen, welcome to Millie's Diner. You're here for the foreclosure, I assume. Well, we're here to make you an offer." The taller of the two men, whose name tag read Richard Pemberton, senior loan officer, tried to maintain his professional composure, but his eyes kept darting to the trucks, to the cameras that had started arriving, to the growing crowd of people who were documenting everything on their phones. "Sir, this is a legal matter between the bank and Mrs. Henderson. I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." Marcus didn't move. "The debt is $340,000, including penalties and interest. We're prepared to pay it in full right now, in exchange for the bank releasing the lien and Mrs. Henderson retaining ownership. We've got certified checks, cash, and wire transfers ready to go. All you have to do is make a phone call to your superiors and tell them the debt is satisfied." Pemberton's face went through several shades of confusion before settling on bureaucratic resistance. "That's not how this works. The property has already been sold to Midwest Truck Stops Corporation. They've paid a premium for this location, and the transaction is finalized pending possession. Even if you pay the debt, the sale stands." It was the answer Marcus had expected, the corporate double-cross that happened when big money wanted something and small people stood in the way. But Marcus had been preparing for this moment, had spent the last 3 hours on the phone with Sarah, Wildflower Chin, learning the intricacies of Colorado foreclosure law and finding the loopholes that banks' preferred people didn't know about. "Actually, Richard, that's exactly how this doesn't work. Colorado law requires a 10-day right of redemption period after foreclosure sale, during which the original owner can reclaim the property by paying the full debt plus costs. You jump the gun by scheduling possession today, which means the sale isn't actually finalized, which means Millie still has legal standing to redeem. And since we're here with the money, and since every camera in this parking lot is recording this conversation, I'm thinking your bank might want to reconsider its position before this becomes a public relations nightmare about a heartless corporation stealing a beloved community institution." The silence that followed was beautiful. Pemberton's face went from pink to red to a pale shade of panic as he realized that the simple foreclosure he'd expected to execute had turned into a legal and media minefield. He pulled out his phone and walked back to his BMW, his voice rising in urgent conversation with someone at the bank's headquarters. The corporate representatives from Midwest Truck Stops Corporation, who'd been waiting in their own vehicle, emerged looking confused and angry, demanding to know why their acquisition was being delayed. While the bureaucrats argued and made phone calls, something else was happening at Millie's Diner. The truckers had started organizing a fundraiser that went beyond just paying the debt. They'd set up tables in the parking lot, were selling Millie's Diner merchandise that they'd created overnight, t-shirts and hats with the diner's logo and the phrase, Route 40's Heart. They'd started a GoFundMe campaign that was already going viral, with donations pouring in from truckers and truck stop employees and regular people across the country who were tired of watching small businesses get crushed by corporate greed. The goal wasn't just to save the diner. It was to give Millie enough cushion to operate without the constant fear of bankruptcy, to repair the roof and update the kitchen and maybe even hire another employee. Millie herself was inside the diner, cooking breakfast for the growing crowd because that's what she did, that's who she was. Even on the day her world was supposed to end, she was still feeding people, still making sure nobody went hungry. Truckers were coming in and ordering food they didn't need, paying with $100 bills and telling her to keep the change, leaving tips that were bigger than the meals. One driver, an older man named Pete Silverback Johnson who'd been coming to Millie's since 1987, handed her an envelope containing $5,000 in cash and a note that read, "You fed my family when I couldn't. Now we feed yours." The news crews had arrived by 11 a.m., local stations at first, then regional, then a national network that had picked up the story from social media, where it was trending under hashtags like #SaveMillies and #TruckersSupportTruckers. The reporters were interviewing drivers, getting stories about what Millie's diner meant to them, collecting testimonials that painted a picture of a woman who'd spent her life in service to others and was now being served by the community she'd built. One trucker told the story of how Millie had let him sleep in the diner's back room when he'd been homeless. Another described how she'd organized a fundraiser when his daughter needed cancer treatment. A third talked about the wall of photos, the memorial cards, the way Millie remembered everyone who'd ever walked through her door. At 11:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the scheduled foreclosure, Richard Pemberton returned from his car looking like a man who just lost a fight he didn't know he was in. "Mrs. Henderson, the bank has agreed to accept payment of the full debt and release the lien. The sale to Midwest Truck Stops Corporation is being voided due to procedural irregularities in the foreclosure timeline. You'll retain ownership of the property." His voice was flat, defeated, the voice of someone reading from a script written by lawyers who'd realized that the cost of fighting this battle was higher than the profit from winning it. The cheer that went up from the parking lot was loud enough to rattle the diner's windows. Truckers were hugging each other, pumping fists in the air, honking their air horns in a symphony of victory that echoed across Route 40 like a declaration that community still mattered, that people still mattered, that the small places that made America human were worth fighting for. Marcus walked over to Millie, who was standing at the counter with her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with the kind of relief that comes when you've been holding your breath for so long you forgot what it felt like to breathe. "Millie, the debt is paid, the diner is yours, and the GoFundMe is up to $180,000 and climbing, which means you've got enough to fix this place up and keep it running for years. You're not closing today. You're not closing ever, not unless you decide you're ready." Marcus's voice was gentle, the voice of a man who understood that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the freedom to keep doing what they love, to keep serving, to keep being the light that guides people home. Millie couldn't speak. She just reached across the counter and grabbed Marcus's hand, holding it like it was the only solid thing in a world that had been spinning out of control. Then she did something she'd done 10,000 times before, something so automatic it was like breathing. She poured him a cup of coffee, black, no sugar, exactly how he liked it, and she slid it across the counter with a smile that was equal parts gratitude and determination. "First cup's on the house, Iron Horse, just like always." The corporate representatives from Midwest Truck Stops Corporation left without a word, their acquisition plans crumbling like stale bread, their vision of turning Millie's into another franchise location evaporating in the face of community resistance. They'd underestimated what they were up against, had thought they were just buying a piece of real estate, not realizing they were trying to erase a piece of people's lives, a touchstone of memory and meaning that couldn't be replaced by efficient service and corporate branding. They'd learned a lesson that day about the difference between a business and a home, between a transaction and a relationship, between profit and purpose. As the day wore on, the celebration at Millie's Diner took on the quality of a festival. Truckers who'd planned to leave stayed, parking their rigs and joining the party. Someone brought a guitar, another driver had a harmonica, and soon there was music mixing with the diesel fumes and the smell of bacon and the sound of laughter that came from people who'd won something important, who'd proven that when you stand together, when you refuse to let the world crush what matters, you can move mountains or at least move banks and corporations. Sarah Wildflower Chin arrived in person around 2 p.m., having driven from Denver to make sure all the legal paperwork was properly executed. She sat with Millie and Marcus, explaining the documents, making sure Millie understood that the diner was truly hers, free and clear, with enough money in reserve to weather any future storms. You've got a lot of people who love you, Millie, and love like that is worth more than any bank loan, more than any corporate buyout. Don't ever forget that. Tommy Wrench Martinez, the mechanic who'd helped coordinate the fundraising, presented Millie with a detailed plan for renovating the diner, upgrades that would modernize the kitchen while preserving the character that made Millie special. We've got contractors lined up who are willing to work at cost, suppliers who will give you wholesale prices, and about 50 truckers who have volunteered their labor for the construction. We're going to make this place shine, Millie, but it's still going to be your place, still going to feel like home. As the sun started to set on what was supposed to be Millie's last day, she stood in the doorway of her diner watching the trucks begin to pull out, their drivers heading back to their routes, their loads, their lives on the highway. Each one stopped to say goodbye, to thank her for the years of service, to promise they'd be back. Marcus was one of the last to leave, his Peterbilt idling in the parking lot as he gave Millie one final hug. You taught us something today, Millie. You taught us that the places we love are worth fighting for, that community isn't just a word, it's an action. And you gave us the chance to be the kind of people we want to be, the kind who show up when it matters. Millie watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing into the gathering darkness, and she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate hope of someone barely hanging on, but the solid, unshakable hope of someone who knows they're not alone, who understands that they're part of something bigger than themselves, a web of connection and care that stretches across highways and state lines and the lonely miles between here and there. The GoFundMe campaign eventually raised $340,000, exactly matching the debt that had been paid, which meant Millie had a full year's operating budget in reserve. The story of Millie's Diner went viral, inspiring similar efforts across the country where communities rallied to save local businesses from corporate takeovers and bank foreclosures. Millie became something of a celebrity, appearing on morning talk shows and in magazine articles, but she never let it change her. She still opened the diner at 5 a.m., still poured coffee with a smile, still remembered everyone's name and their stories. The wall of photos grew, new pictures joining the old, images of the convoy that saved the diner, of Marcus and the other truckers who'd answered the call, of the celebration that had turned a day of loss into a day of victory. Millie added a new sign above the counter, hand-painted by a trucker who was also an artist, that read, "Community is the fuel that keeps us moving forward." Marcus continued his routes, his Tuesday and Friday stops at Millie's as regular as sunrise. But now when he walked through that door, he felt something different, a pride that came from knowing he'd been part of something important, something that mattered. He'd driven millions of miles in his career, had seen every corner of America from the cab of his truck, but the 12 hours he'd spent organizing the convoy to save Millie's Diner were the miles that meant the most, the journey that reminded him why he'd chosen this life in the first place. Other truckers started organizing similar efforts when they heard about small businesses in trouble, creating a network of support that operated through CB radios and social media, and the informal communication channels that connected drivers across the country. They called it the Millie's Protocol, a commitment to show up for the people, and places that had shown up for them, to use their collective power not for politics or protest, but for preservation, for protecting the small lights that made the highway feel less like exile and more like home. The corporate truck stop chain that had tried to buy Millie's location eventually gave up on that stretch of Route 40, unable to compete with the loyalty and love that surrounded the independent diner. They built their franchise, 20 miles down the road, a gleaming, efficient operation with clean restrooms and fast service and absolutely no soul. Truckers stopped there when they had to, but they ate at Millie's when they could, understanding the difference between convenience and community, between a transaction and a relationship. Millie herself worked for another 7 years before finally retiring at age 72, selling the diner not to a corporation, but to one of her longtime employees, a woman named Rosa who'd been working the morning shift for 15 years and understood what Millie's meant to people. The transition was smooth, the character of the place unchanged, because Rosa had learned from the master that running a diner wasn't about food service. It was about creating a space where people felt seen and valued and human. On Millie's last day of work, the parking lot filled with trucks again, drivers coming from across the country, to say thank you and goodbye to the woman who'd fed them and cared for them and reminded them that they mattered. Marcus was there, of course, now in his 60s and thinking about his own retirement, and he stood with Millie watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. "You know what the best part of all this was?" Millie asked him. "It wasn't being saved, though that was pretty good. It was learning that all those years I spent taking care of people, they were taking care of me too. I just didn't know it until I needed them." Marcus nodded, understanding in his bones what she meant, because that was the secret of the road, the truth that kept drivers coming back even when the miles were long and the loads were heavy and the loneliness pressed in like fog. You weren't alone out there. You were part of a community, a brotherhood and sisterhood of people who understood that we're all just trying to get from here to there. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is be a light for someone else's journey, a warm place in the cold night, a promise kept when the world is full of broken ones. The story of Millie's Diner became legend in trucker culture, told and retold at truck stops and rest areas, a reminder that when the world tries to erase what matters, when corporations and banks and the machinery of modern life threatens to crush the small and beautiful things that make us human, we have a choice. We can accept it or we can fight back, not with violence or anger but with community and solidarity and the simple, powerful act of showing up for each other. And somewhere on Route 40 between Kansas City and Denver, there's still a diner with a gravel parking lot and a neon sign that says Millie's in cursive letters that glow like a promise in the darkness. The coffee's always hot, the food's always good, and if you're lucky enough to stop there, you'll see the wall of photos, the memorial cards, the history of a community built one meal at a time. You'll see the sign that says community is the fuel that keeps us moving forward. And if you ask about it, someone will tell you the story of the day the trucker saved Millie's, the day a woman who'd spent her life serving others learned that service is a circle, not a straight line, and that the love you give comes back when you need it most, carried on diesel fumes and chrome and the unbreakable bonds of the brotherhood of the road.